Good morning, all. This is the Health in the Public Interest weekly seminar, and I remind you that this seminar series is going to essentially end on April 15th. That'll be our last seminar due to the closure of the underlying program. We hope to bring you a similar seminar series through a different venue starting in September. So we have a mailing list that includes everyone who's attended these seminars. So we hope that you'll rejoin us when we start again in September. It'll probably be a once a month seminar, but it'll go pretty much all year except for a couple of summer months if it goes as planned. So the Health in the Public Interest Program is a program that emphasizes social and other non-medical determinants of health, including nutrition, diet, food availability, et cetera, which is something that I'm sure our friend and colleague, Dr. Sherman, will talk about today. The seminar will start with an introduction by Molly Jesselson of Dr. Sherman. And Dr. Sherman will then speak for around 40 or 45 minutes. He may or may not choose to engage the audience before that time. It's up to him. But after the seminar, starting, let's say, at 12:45, we have up to 1:15 to have further questions and discussion if it seems like there's adequate fodder for continuing. So with that, I'll turn it over to Molly, and she will introduce Tom Sherman.
Thanks, Dr. Myers. So Dr. Sherman is a 1977 graduate of Michigan State University, where he got his BS in biochemistry. He then earned his PhD in biochem in 1983 from the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center and Columbia University Medical Center. He did his postdoctoral research in molecular neuroendocrinology at University of Michigan in the Mental Health Research Institute. He first joined the faculty in the Department of Neuroscience and Behavior at the University of Pittsburgh and moved to the Department of Physiology and Biophysics and the Division of Endocrinology and Metabolism at Georgetown University Medical Center in 1996. He is now a professor in the Department of Pharmacology and Physiology, and his research is focused on hypothalamic neuropeptide gene expression. More recently, his interests, writings, and teachings have focused on the endocrinology and biochemistry of metabolism, medical nutrition, and the relationships between nutrition, chronic disease, exercise, sleep, and body weight control. Dr. Sherman is an outspoken advocate for increased medical nutrition education with the aim of creating a generation of physicians who can serve as role models to their patients regarding nutrition, cooking, exercise, and weight control. And his fun fact is that he has been arrested 2 times at anti-war protests in DC, including once where he had to notify Dr. Myers that he was not going to make it to his class. I also had the pleasure of being in his class last semester as part of the biology of health and disease, and it was very interesting. So I think we're in for a great seminar today.
Well, thank you, Molly. Thank you, Adam. That was wonderful. I am very happy to be here. And please, if you have questions, put them in the chat. Hopefully, I'll be able to see them. I have my chat window open, and of course, I'll leave lots of times for questions at the end. Let's see. Here we are. I'm sharing my slides. Here we go. So it was hard coming up with a specific topic to talk about today, but I'm going to focus on one of my favorite topics, and that is the Mediterranean diet, and specifically one aspect of the Mediterranean diet, and that is why I am increasingly trying to focus more on dietary patterns and foods rather than talking about nutrients. So what do I mean by that? Well, so the Mediterranean diet, as I am sure many of you recognize, is a dietary pattern. And it includes, an abundance of fruits and vegetables, of seafood, olive oil, lean meats, and a much more modest intake of red meats and alcohol and dairy. And one of the things I particularly like about this new version of the Mediterranean diet, or a recognition, newly recognized pattern, is that it's really grounded on social eating, on physical activity, of eating together. Um, and it's something that I wish more and more people would pay attention to. Now, one of the things that I do, certainly in the first half of many of my graduate nutrition courses, is I refer not to the, the USDA food pyramid, which has its problems, but on an evidence-based version of a Mediterranean food pyramid that was originally coined by Walter Willett and his colleagues in the Harvard Medical School of Public Health, and in this highly recommended book, Eat, Drink, and Be Healthy, that essentially revises our conception of a food pyramid and does several things that I think make up for many of the deficits of the USDA food pyramid. And that is mostly that they, again, keep it grounded on exercise and weight control. They divide the base between whole grains and plant oils, abundance of fruits and vegetables, and then probably most significantly, divided this protein section of the USDA food pyramid into four different packages of protein: nuts and beans, fish, poultry, and eggs, dairy and calcium, and then red meat used sparingly. And so what I do in my nutrition courses is I sort of go through the evidence for each of these sections of the pyramid, and we sort of critique it, and for the most part, it holds up pretty well. I mean, the alcohol in moderation part probably isn't holding up as well as people had hoped, and the need for multivitamins for most people is probably not necessary. But in general, the food recommendations are doing pretty well. And so in addition to the Mediterranean diet, it is not at all unusual for me to, when I meet my students or we talk about diets, that the students really want me to like whatever their fad diet is, and they ask me about, what do you think about this? Or I'm fasting, or I'm on ketogenic, or whatever. And one of the things that I recognized a long time ago is that all of these popular diets are much more similar to each other than they are to a typical American diet. All of these popular diets sort of ask you to eat real food. They ask you to limit how much sugar is in your diet. They ask you, for the most part, to learn how to cook. And if you do that, you're sort of 90% or more of the way towards a pretty decent diet. And so I don't go out of my way to critique most of these popular diets. But what is the typical American diet, however? Well, unfortunately, it's mostly ultra-processed foods. Right, it's holding pretty steady since about over the last 10 years that the average American gets, almost 58% of their calories from ultra-processed foods. And this leaves sort of a disproportionately small fraction of their total caloric intake with sort of unprocessed, minimally processed whole foods. And even among these whole foods, the vegetables that are in there are sort of dominated by tomatoes, lettuce, and potatoes. And of course, those are the three ingredients that sort of accompany the typical American hamburger. and the average American eats 3 hamburgers per week. More than 1/3 of adults in the United States on any given day will frequent a fast food restaurant or a pizza restaurant. And so this is what I'm up against. This is what many people are facing because our environment, our food environment, has increasingly become ultra processed. And just sort of quickly as an aside, ultra processed foods can probably be most simply defined as foods that, for most practical reasons, cannot be made in a typical kitchen. They involve ingredients, they involve processes, they involve procedures that are not typically accessible. And it's sort of like the difference between a minimally processed food like corn on the cob versus a processed food like frozen or canned corn versus, of course, Doritos, or Fruit Loops or some analogous process. And um, and so this has increasingly dominated our diet. But okay, so ultra processed foods have been pretty well. I'll get to that in a second. So what exactly is the problem? Okay, these are sort of modern food preparation techniques that have sort of bloomed since the Second World War. They're cheap, they're ubiquitous. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that they are unambiguously associated with weight gain. And again, that's something that is plaguing us among all of the other non-communicable diseases like hypertension and hypercholesterolemia and excessive weight gain and all of this. And this was shown quite elegantly by a colleague who used to be at NIDDK, Kevin Hall, who did these sorts of clinical studies. And what his superpower was is that he had a clinic where he would bring people into the clinic and keep them there and define what they ate. And in this case, they were there for a month. And he brought them in and he divided them into two groups. And one group was exposed to a cafeteria that was mostly ultra processed foods. And the other group was exposed to a cafeteria containing mostly unprocessed foods, whole foods. And then after 2 weeks, they switched. And they went to pretty considerable length to try to match these foods, to match the appetizing aspects of them and their taste. And really, the people judge these foods pretty tasty. And what they found, which astounded me, really, is that during the 2 weeks they were eating an ultra processed food diet, they were exposed to the ultra processed cafeteria, they consumed 500 more calories per day. And therefore, as a result, they gained a little bit of weight over those 2 weeks. And on the 2 weeks they were exposed to the whole food diet, they lost some of that weight. And so this is a 2-week program, and of course the worry is, of course, that if you eat this pattern for a lifetime, you're going to gain an excessive amount of weight. And you can see it in lots of different dietary patterns. Here, for example, looking at dietary compositions by different macronutrient groups, you could see that, when you look at all the different macronutrients that comprise our diet, none of them have really changed very much. Maybe the cereals and grains went up a little bit towards the turn of the century, and fats and oils seem to have gone up a little bit. But in general, the pattern is about the same. But what is different, consistent with what I just showed you, is that the total calories has gone up significantly, 500 or more calories per day. And of course, if your weights are stable back in the 60s and 70s, then the logical result is you're going to gain weight as you eat this pattern. So that's the concern. Ultra processed foods seem to be associated with weight gain. You know, there hasn't really been any good studies other than that with ultra-processed foods, and we assume that they are unhealthy. We assume they contribute to increased risks of many other, hypertension and cardiovascular disease and all of that. But really, it hasn't been studied very much. But that's the presumption. And for all of you Gen Zers out there, here's the American diet by emojis. So maybe that will help you understand it a little bit better. Took me forever to do that, by the way, but my girls liked it. Okay, so getting back to the Mediterranean diet. So what I've been focusing on is looking at dietary patterns, looking at the influence of dietary patterns as a gauge of health and there are lots of different versions of that. I mean, one of my favorites is a study called Diet Fits that I'll just give you a 30-second synopsis where they essentially broke the groups into two, one focusing on low fat and the other looking at low carb and asking them to cook and to avoid fast food and to avoid restaurants as much as possible. And what they found is that no matter what macronutrient they focused on, carbs or fat or protein, that people generally lost weight, without paying considerable attention to the numbers of calories being consumed. So it was sort of an indirect um, confirmation of the role of ultra-processed foods in our diet. And so I like that kind of dietary pattern study. But why am I talking about dietary patterns rather than nutrients? It's very clear that over the last many years, we have moved on from eating food to consuming nutrients. And this all started when scientists or nutritionists or the public or companies, would start focusing on what nutrients in our food, trying to explain the benefits that you get by eating a diet rich in fruits and vegetables. So, for example, why do you eat avocados? Do you eat avocados? Because I had an avocado on my oatmeal this morning. I really enjoy savory oatmeals with olive oil, salt, and pepper. And but do I eat that because honestly it tastes delicious or it's creamy and rich? Or do I eat it because it has a healthy form of plant cholesterol? Or do I eat it because of the fiber or because it's packed with anti-inflammatory compounds like carotenoids and whatever? Do I put blueberries on my granola sometimes because it has ascorbic acid and salicylic acid and polyphenols and fiber? Or do I eat it because they're crisp and fruity and tart? And so this focus on nutrients sort of exaggerates how much we know about what is in our food. And this has sort of led to people focusing excessively on these. And it was really one of the challenges that I continually face when I'm trying to teach an evidence-based nutrition course is how do I keep the focus on food without undue attention to the ingredients and nutrients that the students are expecting me to talk about. And so that leads to one of my random nutrition rules, that is nutrients if ever, replace the foods that contain them. And there are corollaries to this, of course, and that is that when you speak about nutrients, the presumption is that the average person doesn't understand what they are. And when you don't understand something and you make something complicated, then you seek experts. And where do you find experts? Of course, online. And online, everybody is an expert. And so the advice changes from person to person, and people create followings, and people create specific fads. And all of these lead to not only new popular diets, but really just a lot of the malarkey that infects modern nutrition recommendations. And what we call this whole communication pattern is something called nutritionism. Now, this was a term that was coined originally by Georgi Skrinis, a sociologist and food writer from New Zealand, but it was popularized by Michael Pollan. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of Michael Pollan's earlier books on looking at whole foods. And what nutritionism is this corrupting ideology that assumes that it is the scientifically identified nutrients in food that determine its value. The reason we eat carrots is not because they're crisp and sweet, but we eat carrots because it contains beta carotene, which is an antioxidant. We don't eat blueberries except for because they're a superfood that has lots of antioxidants. And honestly, 2 or 3 months doesn't go by when a supermarket or a radio station will contact me saying, please come in and talk about the newest superfoods. And they're always disappointed when I say, there are no superfoods. It's just marketing. It's just marketing. And I just won't participate in that kind of thing anymore. So for example, you know, General Mills is really good at this. And here they have an ad campaign where, ready to eat breakfast cereals are a secret superfood, and that Cinnamon Toast Crunch has more zinc in it than chia seeds, or that this a serving of Honey Nut Cheerios has as much, I forget, vitamin C as kale, and so on and so forth, and that chocolate checks it provides as much iron than half a cup of black beans. So all of these sort of talking about it, the vitamin and supplement and nutrient supplementation of breakfast cereals has been around from the very, very beginning. And of course, what they're not telling you is is the iron absorbed from chocolate checks as efficiently as it is from black beans? What nutrients are in black beans that do not appear in chocolate checks? How much sugar does chocolate checks provide compared to black beans? Which of these makes a better contribution to your diet? And of course, people don't focus on that. They say, oh, well, I'm getting my nutrients. Nothing illustrates nutritionism more succinctly than the beta carotene trials. And these beta carotene trials was sort of a list of about four different huge clinical trials that came out towards the end of the 20th century, looking at typically antioxidants or vitamins in the diet as a treatment for preventive treatment, perhaps of cardiovascular disease or cancer or lung cancer specifically. And this particular one, was in New England Journal of Medicine, looking at the effect of vitamin E and beta carotene on the incidence of lung cancer in male smokers. So of course they're looking at middle-aged male smokers because they're at a higher risk of lung cancer, and perhaps their study would help prevent the incidence of lung cancer. So you begin to read the paper and you see the abstract, and the background is epidemiological evidence indicates that diets high in carotenoid-rich fruits and vegetables, as well as high serum levels of vitamin E and beta carotene, are associated with a reduced risk of lung cancer. Okay, so let me translate this for you. Okay, here's the translation. Observational cohort studies found that higher consumption of fruits and vegetables is associated with a reduced risk of lung cancer. Okay, so that's the observation. They found that people who eat lots of fruits and vegetables, and undoubtedly engage in other constructive, healthy behaviors like trying to maintain a healthy weight and exercising and seeing their doctor more often and that so on and so forth, had a lower risk of lung cancer. Okay, so what do we do with that for a clinical trial with looking at the antioxidants, vitamin E and beta carotene? Okay, they did a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled primary prevention trial using supplements of vitamin E, alpha tocopherol, or beta carotene, or both, in about 30,000 male middle-aged smokers in southwestern Finland. So they gave them pretty hefty doses of each, or control, or placebo, and they followed them for 5 to 8 years. Okay, so obviously what they're doing, the assumption that they're making is that, oh, so people eat fruits and vegetables. And when you eat fruits and vegetables, the contents of those fruits and vegetables go up in your blood. And the one that we identify in there is beta carotene, forgetting the thousands of other nutrients that go up as well. And so if we give beta carotene, it should mimic that. So that's the assumption, right? And so what happened? Oops, the risk of lung cancer goes up with beta carotene. So that was unexpected, clearly. But it illustrates a good point, is that supplementing with a nutrient very seldom replaces the efficacy of the food it came from. And not realize, the authors clearly did not realize that beta carotene as an antioxidant becomes a pro-oxidant when it's in an oxygen-rich environment like the lung. And so that's a big oops, right? But it didn't have to lead to an increase in lung cancer to illustrate that it was just a naive assumption based on nutritionism, but it doesn't change the marketing, right? I mean, you see this at the grocery store, you see it at the supplement aisle, you see it where people can buy supplements to make up or attempt to make up their lack of eating fruits and vegetables. You know, for $62, you can get 30 servings of a concentrate of many of the nutrients or many of the constituents of fruits and vegetables. And they're all over the place, right? I mean, you see these everywhere. And so no, they're not effective. No, they're not replacing fruits and vegetables in your diet, but people think they do, right? That's nutritionism. We're focused on the nutrients. We're not focused on the food. And look, it contains proven superfoods. So so what's a superfood? It's something that we just call a superfood. They're clinically tested, right? Well, that's my nutrition rule number 31. Studies funded by corporations get results that favor corporations. It's a reality. It's frustrating. You don't want to think poorly of our research colleagues that work in corporations, but what else do you say? You know, if 83% of independently funded studies find an association between soft drink consumption and weight gain, but 83% of industry-funded studies don't find an association, what exactly are you supposed to think, right? You know, and Marion Nestle, a colleague at New York University, writes a really smart blog called foodpolitics.com. And she wrote a book that really exposes the methods that food companies use to skew the science of what we eat and how they make results look favorable. You know, Coca-Cola did it with their connections with weight gain. Palm Wonderful lost a huge lawsuit with all their excessive claims of impacts of health and yogurts and as a probiotic. It's, you know, it's a perfectly good food, but is it really a probiotic? These sorts of things go on and on. And so why do companies fund food studies? I mean, you're not going to be able to patent broccoli. You're not going to be able to patent blueberries. Well, they're not interested in the science. They're interested in the marketing. That's what they're interested in. And what these studies constantly show, this sort of unending flow of positive research data, what it does is it skews the perception of those food groups. Beef generally has people love beef, people eat beef, but it's got sort of a bad reputation. And so just years and years of study um, by the Beef Checkoff program, by their investment in nutrition research, yielding papers like this, the effect of varying quantities of lean beef as part of a Mediterranean style diet. These sorts of things lead to a better atmosphere for beef, and it allows them to market more effectively. And beef does have a bad reputation, but it's excessively colored by one, the environmental impacts. Excessively colored by the ecological impacts beyond the health. And 10%, 50% of beef is consumed by about 10% of the people. And they sort of skew the data because they eat few vegetables and exercise less and drink more alcohol. And so we don't really know what the impact of eating a modest portion of beef along with lots of fruits and vegetables and exercising. And so we have a distorted view of many of the foods because of these kinds of studies. And of course, single food nutrient studies are always funded by that food. It's impossible to look at a single food in your diet and change it to another food and study its impact. We just don't have that capability. So when you see that daily blueberry consumption improves blood pressure, et cetera, then you can just guess that you're going to see this was funded by a blueberry lobbying group. I love blueberries, but these are exactly the kinds of studies you shouldn't pay attention to. So what studies should you pay attention to? Well, that's when we get back to dietary patterns. What about studies that look at diets and not at nutrients? Probably the poster child for this kind of study is the DASH diet, the dietary approach to stop hypertension. So using a control American Heart Association low-fat diet versus a fruit and vegetable rich diet versus a combination diet that's more Mediterranean along with fish and whole grains and beans and lentils and olive oil. They showed that compared to a control, that eating fruits and vegetables or combining it with more fish and whole grains, et cetera, that you get clinically meaningful, clinically significant decreases in systolic and diastolic blood pressure. That this is a true food as medicine approach for taking control of your blood pressure. And these decreases in blood pressure are comparable to typical first-line antihypertensive treatment. In fact, they showed in a subsequent DASH Diet 2 study by titrating urinary sodium excretion as a function of mean arterial pressure, that they could demonstrate that the DASH diet lowers blood pressure in a natriuretic diuretic mechanism, meaning that it's not magic. It's not lowering blood pressure within a black box. It's lowering blood pressure by targeting mechanisms that we target with typical pharmacology. So it really can be effective. And now, why do fruits and vegetables lower blood pressure? Well, then you have to step back and perhaps look at nutrients. And this is where I'm constantly sort of having to wrestle with this. I mean, fruits and vegetables are naturally low in sodium and naturally high in potassium. And so when you look at this list that I made of just typical whole foods, then you can see the ratio of sodium to potassium is astonishingly low. Whereas if you look at many frozen or popular foods, that the ratios are 10 times higher or much more. I sort of lived on turkey pot pies when I was in graduate school, and it just sort of horrifies me how much salt I was eating. But okay, that's the way frozen and prepared foods typically are. And so what the DASH diet is doing is lowering blood pressure, essentially by lowering salt in our diet. So what are other studies? Well, there's two other ones that I really like. This one is the Predimed study on primary prevention of cardiovascular disease with a Mediterranean diet. And what they did is they enrolled about 7,500 people of middle age. The older I get, the higher the upper end of middle age has become. And and so what they did is they broke them into three groups. One was a control American Heart Association low-fat diet, and the other two were Mediterranean diets, either enriched in nuts or enriched in extra virgin olive oil. And what they showed over a 5.5 year period is that those on the Mediterranean diet had a 30% decreased risk of cardiovascular endpoints, not cholesterol levels, not blood pressure, but actual events like MI or stroke or death from cardiovascular disease. And back, I know I'm exaggerating the statistics a little bit here, but back when the government would actually give public health advice and they were campaigning to make sure you were careful with your iron supplement pills because they were so poisonous to children, or they were encouraging people to stop smoking. One of the things we would say is on the day you stop smoking, you're healthier. On the day you quit smoking, you're healthier. And here are middle-aged people switching to a Mediterranean style diet, and on the day they start eating better, they're healthier. Their risks start going down. And so I tell my students, tell your parents about this. Your dad is going to say, oh, I've been eating this way my whole life. It's never too late. It's never too late. The other one I like is this EPIC elderly prospective cohort study where they showed another power of the Mediterranean diet and that it can be adapted to include foods that are recognized by any country. So can you make a Mediterranean diet that's recognized by a Norwegian or a Swede or a Dane? And so what they did is they designed all these Mediterranean diets that included foods that Germans would recognize or Swedes. And so they got over 74,000 men and women, again, of middle age, and they counseled them to eat these diets. And at the end of 5 to 8 years, they scored their adherence to this diet. And what they found is that they scored them on a scale of 0 to 10. And for every 2 unit increment, they saw a decrease in all-cause mortality by 7%. So that's pretty powerful. And so again, sort of wrapping up, Mediterranean diets can be, made familiar to Asians or Latin Americans or African Americans or vegetarians and so it just includes foods, it includes beverages, it includes preparations that they're going to recognize. Now, I'm sure I'm going to get questions on that. And so I just wanted to include these new MAHA dietary guidelines for Americans, for the new inverted pyramid. And just very quickly, just look at my critique of Secretary Kennedy Jr.'s recommendations. It's clear right up front that there is a disconnect between the image they're presenting with this inverted pyramid, which I'm sure they thought was really novel, and the written guidelines. And the written guidelines are somewhat more sensible, but of course people aren't going to read the guidelines. They're going to look at this image. And what do they see on the image? They see that whole grains are relegated to the bottom, that steak and cheese and ground beef and whole milk uh, is up prominently displayed, with their recommendations for higher protein. And, the disdain for evidence is just disappointing. So one, they're just disregarding whole grains, okay, which was on the base of the healthy eating pyramid. And the data on whole grains is compelling. They took this really nice separation of of protein packages, and not only recombine it, so they're essentially equating steak with fish, with yogurt, um, but they then double the recommendations for protein. And they get rid of plant oils. They have just complete disregard for plant oils, despite everything that we've learned about them. And now are recommending not only that you keep your saturated fat levels at less than 10%, but to do so by cooking with butter and beef tallow and eating beef and cheese. And it's just not possible. Um, they don't recognize that people who are not lifting weights and excessively exercising, that when you increase this amount of protein, it's just going to lead to weight gain, just like eating extra carbs. I mean, your metabolism takes extra proteins that aren't needed for muscle and stores it as fat, just like it does with carbohydrates. Um, it doesn't talk about ultra processed foods. It sort of disregards the science of diet sodas and their possible role in decreasing glucose intake. There's just a whole list of things that I find disappointing, and I can always talk more about that. But thank you. I see I have questions from Jane and James in the chat, and perhaps more. How would you like me to prioritize it, Molly?
So we normally start with happy students first, and then if
Okay.
we have time after that, we'll move to the public.
Do you want me to stop my share?
Uh,
It's
it's up
probably
to
best.
you.
I'm sorry, Adam.
It's probably best. I mean, I know
Okay,
you can pull it up quickly if you need to.
that's true.
Let me see. Okay, so Taruni has a question, so I will read that. Dr. Sherman, thank you so much for your talk today. I took a gerontology course where we discussed blue zones, where longevity is often linked to culturally embedded diets and lifestyles in places like the Mediterranean. How important would you say it is to focus on regional food patterns and lifestyle contexts rather than isolated nutrients? And how would you suggest nutrition recommendations be integrated into more general public health messaging, particularly when promoting impactful changes with the DASH diet, for example?
Well, so I mean, clearly it's attractive to look at areas where longevity is longer than average. But really the concept of blue zones has essentially been, it's really a factor of very poor record keeping, and these people are not nearly as old as they think they are. And so that data has largely been refuted. But that doesn't mean they're not eating well. And their dietary patterns are interesting to look at. They really do eat smaller portions. They eat not very much meat. They don't eat as much seafood as you might guess, but it really sort of depends on the pattern. Um, as to how we should reconcile that in terms of recommendations. I don't want to be too cynical, but but people don't listen to recommendations. When you look at that inverted food pyramid, what I see is a food pyramid that's essentially acknowledging this is what people eat. They don't eat whole grains. 85% of grains are processed, and they eat lots of meat. And as much as we want them to eat vegetables, people would rather eat meat. And so yes, we can tell them that eating these patterns is healthier and better for you. And not only that, delicious, because people do have this perception that eating healthy means you're eating unsatisfyingly tasting foods. They don't listen to it. So how best to communicate is more one-on-one. And that's why when I teach medical students and future healthcare workers, I really want them to serve as role models in that one-on-one, you could say, I could work with you on this, but there are challenges way beyond healthy eating. Like, how are you going to get them to pay for it? How are you going to get them to have time in the day to cook? What are they going to do about their children home alone after school that are eating fast foods? I mean, there are just many bigger issues for many people than whether or not they're going to eat vegetables for dinner. And so there are lots of constraints to be able to do that. It's clear.
Thank you. The next question is CM.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Sherman, for your wonderful talk today. My question is that recently there's been emphasis on protein consumption, not only in the inverted food pyramid, but also through the creation of protein-containing products. And as you brought up, we're not really seeing protein deficiency as an issue in the United States. But I have heard people talking about how it's linked to GLP-1 use and how people who are on GLP-1s need more, and that diet idea is thus influencing the greater masses. I was wondering how you thought GLP-1 use was influencing the diets of not only people who are on GLP-1s, but those who are not, but maybe taking in nutrition information regarding people who are on GLP-1s.
It's interesting, and we're still at the stage where a lot of the information we're getting is anecdotal. But that anecdotal evidence is suggesting that people who are losing weight, on these GLP-1 receptor agonists, do choose a healthier diet, but increasing protein on these diets isn't necessarily going to preserve lean body mass compared to fat loss. You really have to exercise. And and that's something we've always been recommending. And so, eating, right now, the average American gets more than enough protein. Um, and so is doubling that really an effective strategy for anything? I would argue not. I mean, only 3 or 4% of Americans get enough fiber. So why aren't we recommending protein sources that are high in fiber? Why steak and not lentils and beans? Why ground beef and dairy rather than, other foods that contain fiber and would sort of help many of the GI issues that people wrestle with? Um, but the GLP-1 dietary intake data is still very anecdotal. And like there was an article the other day about how people who used to hate exercise, once they're on GLP-1s and start losing weight, enjoy exercise. Okay, so that's interesting, but what percent of the people are doing that? Like how many are we talking about? Is it like the 3 people in the article, or is it a significant fraction of the people taking GLP-1 receptor agonists? It's really, really hard to know. But it's a good question, and it's one that we hope to answer sometime in the future. Thank you, CM.
Okay, and Sasha has a question in the chat. She says, Hi, Dr. Sherman. Thank you for such an interesting lecture. I thought your discussion of marketing over science and food studies was so insightful, particularly your example of superfoods. Even as someone who is interested in health, I find myself falling for these types of marketing. How can we as po health policy students raise more awareness slash promote education on these types of marketing campaigns so the general public is more aware of the right foods to buy and to not be overwhelmed or heavily influenced by the amount of choices at the grocery store?
So there's several things you can do, Sasha. And one of them, which the high school students that I deal with would just do with great joy, is they take marketing messages and they critique them. And it's actually fairly entertaining. And so they'll take a poster and they'll critique it and write on it what the real message is. But secondary, be more thoughtful. Like when you see a study saying that eating nuts is going to decrease your risk of cardiovascular disease, sort of reinterpret and translate that message in the newspaper as to what it probably showed. What it probably showed is that there's an association. The original study probably demonstrated an association between nut consumption and a decreased risk of cardiovascular disease. And so, what is it about people who increase nut consumption? Well, so they recognize that this is a good alternative source of protein despite growing up in a low-fat atmosphere like your parents did. And what are they eating less of as a result of eating nuts? Are they eating nuts instead of red meat? Okay, well, that would be interesting. And because they're eating nuts and they're more aware, does that mean they're making other healthy lifestyle choices? All of those sorts of things are going to contribute to a decreased risk that epidemiologists are fully aware of. It's just very, 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 very difficult to crack in the data. And the other thing, the really easy thing, which is challenging, but I say it's easy because I love to cook, is that if you're staying on the perimeter of a grocery store and you're buying whole foods and vegetables, you don't have to worry about marketing. You're not going down that aisle. So you're just looking for ingredients for cooking your dinner. And that changes everything. You're taking control of your diet and you're not letting companies cook for you. Now you're students, and you've got limited kitchens, you've got limited time, it's hard to cook for yourself. So this is a stage in your life where you just should recognize that, try to develop healthy habits as you move along so that when you are in a position to have a real kitchen and real time, you can take advantage of it. Read cookbooks. You would be shocked how incentivizing it is when you see a recipe that just really appeals to you. You'll find a way of making it. Right, Molly?
Okay, let me see if there's anyone. If none of the other happy students have a question, I will ask one before we move on to the general public. I'm not seeing any of us. Okay, so what I was wondering was, I've seen various legislation. I think some of it has been passed in some states, and in other states, it's kind of just being talked about. But it's about policing, like what can be purchased um, with SNAP benefits. And so I was kind of curious because, like, I know there a lot of them are trying to ban, like, specifically soda or candy or something. And obviously, like as you mentioned, sometimes that products that are like ultra processed are the only things people can afford. So I was kind of curious where you stand on that, or if there's any sort of research going on about how enacting or not enacting that
Yeah. As
affects people.
much as you sort of recognize, why getting people to eat healthy is ultimately better for them, I just ask my students and I ask people to check their privilege, and that do you have the privilege of time so that you can think about your health and you can think about dinner? Do you have the privilege of resources so that you can buy fruits and vegetables, recognizing that fast food is cheaper? Do you have the privilege of living in a safe neighborhood so that you are comfortable going out for a walk after dinner? And and maybe when you're poor, having somebody else cook for you is the only chore that you can have somebody else do. And buying fast food or that buying soda is one of the simple pleasures that you encounter. So that's the way I think about it is, think of all the privileges that I have and all of the privileges that many people don't have. And what exactly am I doing by denying things to them? So,
That's really
and a
interesting.
lot of people not on food stamps drink soda.
Yeah. I mean,
So,
here I
so
am.
it's not, yes. So,
Dr. Myers, I see your hand is up.
So, Tom, very nice seminar today, and I kind of like the way that you have um, kind of reevaluated nutritional um, ideas to a more modern approach that gets away from both the original food as medicine approach to and looks at, what do people actually eat. But I got a quick question, which is, especially if you're talking about vegetables, there's an enormous variation in the nutritional value of vegetables. And um, is there any way to categorize vegetables better like we do with whole grains versus, other starchy foods or whatever? I mean,
that's an interesting
carrots,
question.
potatoes,
Yeah.
I could name a lot of things. Celery.
You can ask Adrian, there isn't really a definition of a vegetable, right? And
I mean, most
and
vegetables are either actually fruits or root vegetables, right?
right. And so we tend to speak in terms of starchy versus fibrous or starchy versus non-starchy vegetables. But honestly, I don't make any distinction. My family really likes the cruciferous vegetables, the asparagus and broccolis and cauliflowers and Brussels sprouts and stuff like that. But we eat a broad spectrum of them. And when I was a kid, my dad would tell me the reason why vegetables are good for you is because they fill you up so you don't eat bad stuff. And so he didn't think that they were intrinsically beneficial at all. And that's just simply not the case. But I mean, that's the level of our knowledge, right? So that if you eat lots of fruits and vegetables, sort of good things happen. And we know they contain a zillion different compounds, but we don't know how they all interact and we don't know what they do. And honestly, I'm not sure I care, but it's interesting in terms of categorizing them. And maybe there's an attempt. I'm not sure. Maybe Adrian would know. But I like that question. I'll have to think about it.
Well,
Okay, thank
I'm
you.
just
And
interested that you mentioned cruciferous vegetables because I just had a house guest over the weekend, Elizabeth Jeffrey, who's also known as Madame Broccoli because of her research on cruciferous vegetables. And one of the interesting things that she was telling me is that cooked broccoli actually has an effect in the intestine that's similar to GLP-1. So I think if we spread the at this point rumor that broccoli has a GLP-1 type effect, I think we could really increase the market for cruciferous vegetables.
Yeah, that would be good. Yeah. It is the most popular green vegetable. That doesn't mean it's popular. It just means it's the most popular. So, who else, Molly?
All right, so there's a question in the chat from someone. Hello, Professor Sherman. The NOVA classification has its issues, but as you said about nutrients, some argue that it is a good method to monitor dietary patterns. My question is, how can we inform populations shift to healthier diets without them obsessing on what processing or how much of it is done the same way they have done for nutrients?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the NOVA classification system is somewhat under attack as ultra-processed foods become a little bit more central to our criticism of diets. And of course, there's just the continuum, right? I mean, one of the very first blog posts I ever wrote was some nutrition scientists tried to claim that apples were a processed food. And of course, what they were trying to do is if you can make, they're processed because they're picked and they're polished and they're stacked nicely. And of course, if everything is processed, then nothing is processed, right? I mean, that's clearly what they're trying to do. And so there's a real continuum, and I think a sensible, thoughtful person can look at a food and say, okay, here are some crackers. I went through my kitchen. We had crackers, so I guess you would call that ultra processed. Um, but is that bad or is that pretty distinct from Doritos or whatever? I think people can recognize. The truth is, I mean, and we've always known what comprises a healthy diet. The challenge isn't really telling people what to eat. The challenge is getting people to eat that. That's the challenge. And so my medical students, when we have our food insecurity sessions, we tell them, how do you make food recommendations? How do you send them to sources of food? What food banks are in their area? What kinds of foods, what kind of advice can they give you about how to prepare these foods? That's really practical advice, not telling people you need to lose weight and you need to eat more fruits and vegetables. That's just not solving anything.
The next question is asking, could you talk about salt and the health effect from the consumption of different salts, like sea salt, Celtic salt, iodinized?
That's interesting. Potassium chloride is coming back into favor. It was around when I was a kid as a salt substitute in attempts to trying to increase or decrease the sodium to potassium ratio. And it's one of the, Adrian really likes these inexpensive strategies for public health treatment, and potassium chloride or potassium salt substitutes probably fit in that category. But there's a bitterness to it that most people don't like. But even an otherwise healthy person, and Adam would probably know this better than me, when you start increasing salt, your blood pressure goes up. And as you get older, you become increasingly salt sensitive. And one of the easiest things you can do, I mean, I would argue that the easiest way to dramatically improve your life is to get a good night's sleep. But the second easiest thing you can do is to decrease salt intake by just decreasing the consumption of fast food and restaurant food. And 75% of the salt in our diet comes from frozen and prepared and fast and restaurant foods. And so if you're cooking at home, salt just isn't something you need to worry about. But but it but you should be mindful because as you increase salt, your blood pressure will go up. Now, salt gives foods flavor. So you can't just say as a public health measure, don't eat salt. You're constantly compromising what's a level of salt for flavor versus a level of salt that is that you can get used to. Americans have a tremendously high salt appetite, but if you avoid salt for 3 days, you can resensitize your taste buds so that it's easier to lessen salt in your diet. But just like there's 100 names for sugar, there's 100 names for salt, and sea salt is salt, and it doesn't have iodine in it unless it explicitly says so. So, yeah.
I think this kind of connects to the next question, where they asked, it sounds like any diet utilizing whole foods is better than the standard American diet.
Definitely, definitely. And what Christina says, is why. Oh, is it Christina? No, it's John. John asks, why are good foods advertised? because they're not profitable. Actually, California had sort of a nice ad campaign for a while, that were pretty witty, like kale is 50% less pretentious. No, broccoli is 50% less pretentious than kale. Things like that. I kind of like those ads. Um, but there isn't a single food that's advertised that I would recommend you eat. And so, that's probably the single best thing about streaming on television is that my kids don't see commercials. And so they just don't see this glut of advertising that they are just extremely attracted to. And it's an issue. They're not profitable.
Dr. Myers, how are we on time?
Here, give me 1 second. I have some students outside my door. I'll tell them to wait. So give me a few minutes. Okay, I'm giving a Zoom sound. Yeah. Sorry about that.
What do you think? One more, Dr. Myers, or
Yeah, I think depending on how long the answers are, maybe two questions.
Yeah, I mean, that's fine. I like Christina's question. I'm not sure I completely understand. What's eating hygiene? Are you there, Christina?
I'm here.
Oh, so what's eating hygiene?
Eating hygiene means that when I graduated from high school in the 1960s, and everybody practically was thin, not fat or obese, people ate at set meal times. They didn't eat between meals. They didn't eat or drink in the car. They didn't snack in the living room or the family room or in their bedroom. They had rules about only having sweets on Sunday. There were all kinds of rules. We didn't discuss much about whether mayonnaise was good or bad, or broccoli or green beans. Most food was prepared at home, which is another feminist question. But in any event, compared to Europe, Americans eat anything, anywhere, all the time, and we're fat.
Well, so I would describe our food environment as obesogenic, and we are surrounded by very inexpensive, very tasty food, and it is involved in every one of our activities. And our students recognize this, that, when I ask them to keep a food diary, and ask why they ate something, they'll say, I was studying, I was bored, I was watching television, I was socializing, I was depressed, I was stressed, and sometimes I ate because I was hungry. And so people recognize that they're eating for lots of reasons other than hunger. And of course, that's going to lead to overconsumption. And for every student meeting, every party, every interaction that we have with people involves food. And so it's easy to understand why people overconsume. And you're right, it's just very different now. And the food companies are, they should be held responsible because they design these foods to be overconsumed.
So my dream diet book would be very short. It would be because I'm talking about I grew up in a town, Elgin, Illinois, which was blue class, skilled blue class labor, collar labor, and lower middle class mostly. I look at my high school graduating class of 800, and we can only name maybe 20 out of 800 kids who were fat. So what happened? That's my question.
Well,
And I think it's
the
yeah.
food corporations dictated what the foods that we were exposed to, and people liked them. So that's what happened, you know, and after the Second World War, it just got progressively increased. And right now, more than half our calories are consumed outside the home. And when you eat outside the home, you overconsume and you
So
take too
instead
much
of
home.
discussing what you're eating, how about when you're eating and how much you're eating, and you'd solve the problem, wouldn't you?
Well, as long as you're eating whole foods, yes. So, yeah.
Okay. That's what I mean, I don't, you know, whether it's broccoli, kale, or celery, it doesn't matter if people are eating 7 times a day, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Okay. End of my question.
So if there are no immediate questions, let me thank Tom Sherman again for a very interesting and in many ways appealing presentation today. We look forward to seeing you all back for some great last three, I think, lectures that we're going to have, including lectures on the new war on drugs, which is coming up, and medical racism. So some hard-hitting topics that are among my favorites. And Molly, thank you for moderating today. Great job. And I ask you to give us some final words, unless Adrian has anything she wants to say as well. And we'll see you all next week.
Yep, just want to thank Dr. Sherman again. This was really interesting. I know you had mentioned a little bit about the Mediterranean diet in our class last semester, so it was very interesting to hear the expanded version.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for your questions. I enjoyed myself completely. So take care.